Some people are going to hear this and say, you betrayed our people, or you can't believe in Jesus and be a Jew. My mom actually cried. But this isn't about religion. This isn't about my life. This is just about truth. I'm going to share my story with you because I didn't go looking for Jesus. He found me. And in this way, you really can't make this stuff up. I was raised with a very strong Jewish identity, understanding how we are to be together with our people. I wanted to be a rabbi my whole life. I was born into childhood and wanted to be a rabbi. That was the first thing I ever wanted to do, all the way up until the age of 13 when my parents got divorced. But I went to synagogue every week. I went to Hebrew school every week. I read the Torah. My mom even used to let me skip school to go to synagogue, to go to minyan, which is a meeting time with the older guys at the synagogue, just so I can be a part of it all. I'm not sure exactly what drew me to it, but I was always drawn to God. And as I grew up, I knew that I was chosen for greatness. I knew that I was chosen to be a leader. I knew that this is what I was supposed to do. I'm not really sure exactly why, but this is how I grew up. And I grew up really being a tight, close-knit Jewish community person with my friends and my family, and we were called the Jew crew in school. This is just what happened when I was growing up, and I'm not really sure again what drew me to this, but I knew my mom was a preschool teacher at our synagogue. She was a Hebrew school teacher at our synagogue. I was taught to have all of these relationships very tight knit, and we still celebrate the Jewish holidays. We still be able to go out there and understand what it means to be Jewish. We were taught to give tzedakah, which is charity. We were taught to celebrate the holidays. We had big family holiday dinners. But this is just my story, and I'm going to share it with you. When I was 13, my parents got divorced, and this is where the search for truth really started. Now, for a few years, I pushed it all away. I focused on football. I didn't care about anything. I got into drugs and alcohol and girls, and I didn't do anything in regards to my spirituality, my consciousness, or any of that. But when I came to college at 18 years old and went to University of Miami and left where I came from, I started seeking enlightenment. I started seeking the truth. I started seeking answers. I wanted to learn about consciousness. I attracted my coach, Jeffrey Combs, who I've been coaching with for 11 years now, and he taught me consciousness. And consciousness was a way for me to learn about God that wasn't talking about God. For some reason, I still was rejecting the concept of what God really is. I still thought that God was this figure up in the sky. I still thought that God had to do with Judaism and Christianity and Islam and what the heck is going on in the world, right? But I was always really into understanding truth. I studied consciousness. I read David Hawkins' content on the map of consciousness and studied it to a T. I was able to discern the difference between different religions. I started reading the spiritual texts of all the major religions. Even today, I've read the Old Testament, the New Testament, the Bhagavad Gita, the Quran, the Egyptian Book of the Dead. I've read the Lao Tzu. I've read all of these situations, or the Tao Te Ching by Lao Tzu. I've read all of these different books and these texts just seeking truth. And it's really been something that I've always been into. There's a big draw towards truth. And in the world today, in the new age spiritual world, we are rejecting the concept of God. We reject the concept of religion. Why? Because through generation after generation after generation, the church or the agenda has put this on us. We get taught to separate church and state. We get taught to not talk about God and politics and religion and money in the workplace. In fact, in the last week, literally my mom and dad both have told me to stop talking about God and stop talking about politics. However, every wealthy person that I know, that's all that they talk about. And so it's a societal pressure to not talk about how you feel. Although the people in my office that come to me for advice, they don't ask me about sales advice most of the time. They ask me about life advice. They talk to me about God. They talk to me about consciousness. They want to know because we're all seeking the truth. It is our God-given duty to become enlightened over the course of many lifetimes. And so this is why we all seek that. Enlightenment just simply means to be in the light. And so it is our natural tendency to be drawn toward this concept. Throughout my childhood, my dad was my number one mentor. He taught me about business and leadership. I was always seeking more. And that's when I attracted Jeffrey Combs at 18 years old. He taught me consciousness. He taught me about God. He taught me about understanding. And Jeffrey was my coach from 18 years old and still is today and will be for life. And so I started seeking this opportunity. And when I was 25 years old in 2020, in the middle of all of the greatest chaos that's in the history of the world that's been in, right now with Black Lives Matter and COVID and all these situations happen. I used to own two restaurants and they both got taken away. And so I had to restart my life over. And I came down to Miami and I went deep down the rabbit hole. I started laying at the beach and reading deeper and deeper spiritual texts. But I also was pretty much getting really into drugs and alcohol and had a major issue for a month, just 1 month. But my little brother in my fraternity suggested that I go to a 12-step meeting. And so I went to a 12-step meeting and met my next mentor. My next mentor, his name was Willie. We were really, really close. And we used to spend hours and hours and hours on his porch talking about God, reading the Bible, talking about our search for meaning, right? Talking about what we're doing here, talking about where we come from, where we're going, and why we're here. And he used to teach me a lot about life. Now, he was a 67-year-old big black dude, and I was a 25-year-old little white dude. And we used to always say, why did God bring us together? Right? But he brought me together to find God. He brought me together to take the next step in my journey. He brought me together to start the next phase of my life, which was when I realized that it wasn't all just about business and money, and that's super important, but this other side of consciousness started to develop. This other side of really being a deeply protected, covered, God-chosen man started coming into my life, and that's really was the next phase for me. And a few years into that, the signs started appearing. And again, this is why it wasn't something that necessarily I was seeking. It was something that really found me, but it was an evolution of my own spiritual journey. When I was in 2022, I got connected to a guy in the insurance business, and he was connected to PBD, Patrick Bet-David. And I went in Labor Day weekend, September 2022, to an event, The Vault by Patrick Bet-David. And I sat down, and this dude sat next to me, and he was wearing a black pinstripe suit. And you know, I love my black pinstripe suit. And it frustrated me that this guy was wearing the same color suit as me. But he had this book next to him called Solomon's Trillions. And we started talking about life, and we started talking about God, but he was kind of annoying me because he was matching my suit. And so the next day, I showed up in my purple suit. I said, if I wear a purple suit, there's no way he's going to match me. Lo and behold, this guy wore a freaking purple suit. And I just was like, what the heck is going on? And I thought that it was a sign for some reason. And so I sat next to him again, and we started talking about his book. And he gave me a book, and I read the book. And he said, can we talk next week when you're done? We talked next week. We prayed together. And he taught me to go look at other things that are going on in my life and look for the signs in them. Look for how I'm being led. And he told me to watch the show The Chosen. Now, growing up Jewish, I'm rejecting any show about Jesus. I've never watched any show about Jesus, read any book about Jesus. My mom taught me that Jesus was a Jewish hippie. That's what we learned at home. Or we just learned that he never existed in the first place. And it's very interesting to me. But lo and behold, I watched the show The Chosen, and I ended up binge watching the whole thing. I loved it. All 3 seasons, watched every single one of them, and was like, wow, this is a story that I didn't know. In fact, all of the disciples were Jewish, and they all were being persecuted by the Romans. I didn't know any of this stuff. I just learned that this isn't real, and this isn't what we believe, and this isn't the truth. When in reality, it is absolutely the truth. There is truth and there is not truth, and it is truth. And so I learned about this, and I watched The Chosen. Then I came back to him, and we used to have a call every couple weeks. And he said, now go read the book, The Case for Christ. And this is where the logical side of my brain started making sense of Jesus. The Case for Christ by Lee Strobel talked about how there are all of these different situations that happened to the disciples. There was no political gain. There was no financial gain. There was no any type of gain. In fact, most of them were put in jail, beheaded, and killed for believing this one thing. And why would anybody believe it? Why would anybody go to great depths to speak about it and put themselves out there like that if it wasn't the truth? A few months later, the same year, 2022, my mentor had a stroke. And I used to take him around. I used to go to the hospital to visit him. I used to go take his wife to the hospital because they didn't drive, and they actually gave me their car, another sign. And they gave me a car, and they had a Chevy. All right, a Chevy, I don't know if you realize, but the logo is a cross. And these are all a gold cross. And so I started seeing more signs. And then he finally got out of the hospital. He was on a feeding tube and everything, and we would sit there and pray together. And when he got out of the hospital, the first place he wanted to go was church. The first time I took him to church, I wheeled him in the wheelchair and gave him to the guy at the door, and I didn't go inside. The next week, he called me on Saturday and said, "Josh, I want to go to church again tomorrow." So I took him to church, and he asked if I would sit in the back with him. So I sat in the back with him, the very last row. I sat in the back of church. And this church was in Opelika, which is a not so great area in Miami. And I'm the only white guy in the church. But it's me and Willie, and I, for whatever reason, am loving church. I love the music. I love the pastor. I love the people. I love the love that I feel being in that room. And I took it as a situation like, what the heck is going on? I'm not supposed to like this. Right? This is not what I was taught to do. But I went back again the next week, and I went back again the next week, and I became part of this church. And I was super grateful because they welcomed me. They welcomed me into this church, and I knew that I was being called. I knew that this is what I was supposed to do. And the very next week after that, I went to a networking event. I went to a networking event in Wynwood in Miami, and I met this guy at the bar who was wearing a big Jewish star just like I do. And he invited me to a luncheon. Not a Jewish luncheon, not a business luncheon, but the Men's Christian Business Connection luncheon. I'm like, "Why are you inviting me to this luncheon?" And he said, "Just give me a chance." So I went to this luncheon. And once again, I felt welcomed. I felt connected. I felt like I was supposed to be there. So he invited me to a cigar night at a cigar lounge in Coral Gables, Miami, where usually there's 10 to 20 people there, and for whatever reason, there were only 3 people there. The guy that invited me, Steve, this pastor named Brian, and the head of the Fellowship for Christian Athletes named Jerry. And it was just them 3 and me. And all night long, we just talked about God. We talked about the Bible. We talked about Jesus. And halfway through the night, Brian asked me if I was willing to accept Jesus as my Lord and Savior and willing to let him come into my life. And I said yes in a cigar lounge. And I surrendered, and I'm learning how to surrender one day at a time, to let go of all of the different things that I got preconceived notions about growing up in about Jesus, and realize that if there was any leader to follow, if there was anybody that has created the best business, the best culture, the best situation of love and peace, and shared this with the world, it's Jesus Christ. And since that moment, I've been on my journey in Christianity. Now, I didn't lose my Jewish heritage. I still celebrate all the Jewish holidays. I still go to my mom's house. We still do Tzedakah. We still do Hanukkah. We still do Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Passover, all the major holidays I celebrate. But to me, Judaism is the foundation of Christianity. All of the disciples celebrated the Jewish holidays too. The Last Supper was a Passover dinner. Right, this is the situation. And so we get taught that there's like this black and white situation, that it's like they're 2 totally separate things. But Judaism is just the foundation of Christianity. And again, my mom cried, but I think it's just because of a misunderstanding. And I think the actual crying is a holding back of the truth. And it's very interesting to me because every single one of the disciples and the Jews, they called him a rabbi. They didn't call him a priest. Jesus was a rabbi. Jesus preached in the Gospels in different places in society about how to love each other, about loving one another. And to me, Jesus just basically came along and said in the most layman's terms possible, "Hey guys, we've been doing this thing for a long time, and the world's changed. We can't follow 613 commandments. It's hard enough to follow 10. And therefore, there's really just this one: just love one another. Hold God above all others, the first commandment, and love one another is the greatest commandment of all time." And it's just a new way of thinking. It would be like somebody that still has an 8-track player with a record player and saying, "Hey, don't go for those iPhones. Don't listen to speakers. Don't listen to those things." It's old school. There's so many things. It would be like somebody continuing to do things in an old way, 2,000 years old. That's where Jesus came along and said, he said, "There's all of these new ways of thinking, guys. The world's changed, and we got to welcome in. It's hard to hold people accountable to all of these rules. Why don't we just try to love each other?" And that's really the foundation of it all. But they were all Jewish. It's not this other thing. Christianity is just the following of Jesus. Christianity is just 12 guys that had a new age of Judaism, which is really what Christianity is. It's like new age Judaism, and said, hey, this is really the way that it is today. And a lot of these other people rejected it. But old people are always going to reject stuff. And it's interesting because if you read the Old Testament, they're always looking for the Messiah. And now it's 5,700 years later, and we're still searching for the same thing as a Jewish people. Although that came along 2025 years ago, and we weren't able to recognize it. And so it's important as Jews that we wake up to seeing what that was in society. It doesn't mean that it's a rejection of Judaism, which is what the Pharisees and the Sadducees believed. It was not rejecting Judaism. It was saying this is a new way to think. The world has changed, everybody. Let's just love each other instead of hating on each other and judging each other for not following these rules, which are not as applicable in the world today as they were 5,000 years ago. If you're Jewish and searching, or Muslim and searching, or anything and searching, that means you're called. We are all called by God to take the next step in our lives. It doesn't mean that you're crazy. It means that you're opening up to receiving God's love for you. And so this is something that I'm going to be bringing in more into our content. And so I'd love, if you can, to comment below about your spiritual journey, about your religious journey, about your journey to God, whether you reject Him or not, whether you understand it or not, and where you're at in your world today. I promise I will read every single one, and I would love to connect with you more. And if you want to reach out to me offline, feel free to DM me on Instagram if you want to not make it public. I enjoy this more than I enjoy talking about business and money. So thank you guys for listening to my story, for my testimony, and open up to what God has for you and God's love for you one day at a time.